Imagine being humiliated, handcuffed, and made to look like a criminal. All this in front of a crowd armed with telephones. They think they can break you, but they have no idea who you really are. One wrong move, one word, and their world will never be the same again. But let's start from the beginning. It was one of those crisp New York mornings when the city almost felt peaceful. Christopher James, a 42-year-old black man in a tailored navy suit, strolled through Central Park like he had all the time in the world. He had this air about him, calm, collected, untouchable. But in New York, no one pays attention unless you're causing a scene. People barely noticed him as he checked his phone every few minutes, typing briskly, occasionally glancing around. At the other end of the park, Officer Jacob Reed, a 40-something white cop with a chip on his shoulder and an eye for trouble, was scanning the area like he was on patrol in a spy movie. He caught sight of Christopher and locked on like a heat-seeking missile. To Jacob, the man's every move screamed, "Suspicious." "Yeah, that's the type," Jacob muttered under his breath, tightening his leather gloves like he was prepping for a boxing match, looking around, checking his phone every second. Classic behavior. Probably up to no good. Jacob wasn't a fan of subtlety. The park was mostly empty, so he decided to make his move. With a stiff, commanding posture, he marched toward Christopher, who had just finished a text. "Excuse me, sir," Jacob said, his voice dripping with authority. "Mind stepping over here? We need to have a little chat." Christopher paused mid-step, raising an eyebrow. His face was a perfect blend of confusion and calm. "A chat? About what?" "Suspicious behavior," Jacob replied, crossing his arms like he'd cracked some big case. "You've been looking around, checking your phone constantly. Seems like you're planning something not exactly legal." The words hung in the air like bad karaoke. A few passers-by slowed down, curious about the scene unfolding. Some even pulled out their phones, ready to record. Christopher let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Suspicious behavior? Officer, I was checking my work emails. Unless that's illegal now, I'd say you're overstepping," Christopher said, his voice steady but firm. Jacob didn't like being challenged. He leaned in closer, narrowing his eyes. "Let me tell you something, sir. I decide what's overstepping. Now turn around and put your hands behind your back." The tone of Jacob's voice wasn't a request. It was a verdict. Christopher stood his ground, but before he could say anything, Jacob grabbed his wrist and twisted it into handcuffs with a practiced efficiency. The sound of the cuffs snapping shut was loud enough to make a nearby jogger gasp. The crowd around them grew. A woman muttered, "What is this nonsense? He didn't do anything." Another man called out, "Seriously? This again? What did he even do?" Christopher didn't struggle. He kept his composure, his face unreadable except for a flicker of something cold, something calculated. As Jacob guided him toward the squad car, someone in the crowd shouted, "Hey man, are you okay?" Christopher glanced over his shoulder, nodding slightly, as if to say, "I've got this." But there was something in his eyes, like he was already 2 steps ahead of everyone else. Jacob, oblivious to the phones pointed at him and the murmurs of the growing crowd, shoved Christopher into the back seat. "Another day, another punk off the streets," Jacob muttered, slamming the door. Inside the car, Christopher looked out at the onlookers, his expression unreadable. But beneath the calm exterior, gears were turning. He wasn't just planning his next move, he was planning theirs. The precinct buzzed with its usual chaos, ringing phones, shouting officers, and the occasional slam of a file cabinet. Jacob Reed strutted in, dragging Christopher James behind him, looking like he'd just solved a high-profile case. He threw a smug glance at his colleagues, who barely looked up. "Another one off the streets," Jacob announced, to no one in particular. "People like him, always up to something. Then they cry foul when they get caught. Christopher said nothing. His silence, steady and unshaken, only fueled Jacob's frustration. He led Christopher into a small, dim interrogation room, the flickering fluorescent light doing its best impression of a crime show. Jacob shoved Christopher into a metal chair and slammed a blue folder on the table with the flair of someone who just uncovered state secrets. "All right," Jacob started, sitting across from him, leaning back like he owned the place. "Who are you, and what were you doing in that park? Make it quick. I've got better things to do." Christopher, calm as ever, tilted his head slightly. "I'd like to hear your grounds for arresting me first." "My grounds?" Jacob let out a short laugh. "You were acting suspicious, buddy. Looking around, glued to your phone, textbook case of someone up to no good." "Buddy," Christopher repeated, his tone icy. "Is that the official term you use in your reports?" Jacob stiffened, caught off guard by the calm precision of the question. Before he could respond, the door opened, and in walked Sergeant Green. The older black officer had the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen it all. His sharp eyes darted between the two men. "Reed," Green started, voice low and commanding. "What's this about?" Jacob puffed up. "Caught him acting suspicious in the park. Looked like he was planning something. You know the type." "Enough," Green interrupted, narrowing his eyes. "Take the cuffs off. Now." "What?" Jacob's voice cracked. "But sir." "Do it," Green snapped. He turned to Christopher, giving him a look Jacob couldn't decipher. "And do it quickly." Reluctantly, Jacob unlocked the cuffs, the sound echoing in the tense room. Christopher rubbed his wrists, his movements deliberate and calm. "Thank you," he said evenly. Jacob's confidence wavered. For the first time, he felt like the rug had been pulled out from under him, and he didn't know why. One thing was certain, this wasn't going the way he thought it would. Jacob Reed stormed out of the interrogation room, his mind racing. His usual smug confidence had been replaced with a gnawing sense of unease. Something about Christopher's calm demeanor and Sergeant Green's reaction didn't sit right with him. What was he missing? Who was this guy? Jacob paced the hallway, trying to shake the feeling that he'd just made a massive mistake. Inside the room, Sergeant Green leaned in slightly, his voice low and respectful. "General Prosecutor James, are you all right?" he asked, his tone carrying a hint of urgency. Christopher gave a small nod, adjusting his cufflinks with practiced ease. "Surprisingly, yes," he replied, his voice steady. "Though I admit, this was enlightening." Green nodded, his expression grim. "I'll make sure this is handled properly, sir. He doesn't know who he's dealing with." Christopher's lips curved into a faint smile, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, he'll find out soon enough." Moments later, the door opened, and Jacob marched back in, his face flushed with frustration. But what he saw stopped him in his tracks. Christopher was no longer in handcuffs. He sat with an air of quiet authority, exuding a confidence that was impossible to ignore. "What the heck is this?" Jacob blurted out, his voice cracking with disbelief. "Who are you, really?" Christopher rose from his chair with the kind of poise that only came from years of commanding rooms much bigger and more intimidating than this one. He adjusted his jacket and straightened his tie, each movement deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. "My name," Christopher began, his voice calm but razor sharp, "is Christopher James. I am the Attorney General of New York State, and you, Officer Reed, have just made the single largest mistake of your career." The words hit like a thunderclap. Jacob's jaw dropped, his face going pale as the gravity of the situation sank in. The room suddenly felt much smaller, the air heavier. The door clicked shut behind him, the sound echoing like a final nail in a coffin. Christopher's eyes bore into Jacob's, cold and unyielding. "You see, Officer Reed, while you were busy playing hero, you failed to recognize the one thing you should never ignore in your line of work: context. No, don't." Jacob opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His mind raced as he tried to process the bombshell he'd just been hit with. This wasn't just a bad day, it was career-ending. "Now," Christopher continued, his voice still calm, "I suggest you start preparing for the consequences of your actions, because, trust me, they're coming." As Christopher stepped past Jacob, the tension in the room was palpable. Jacob stood frozen, unable to move, his thoughts consumed by one haunting question. What have I done? What would you have done in Christopher's place? How do you think Officer Reed should have handled the situation? Share your thoughts, drop a comment, and let us know if you or someone you know has faced something similar. Don't forget to like and share to spread awareness. This story was created to shed light on important issues and spark meaningful conversations. Together, we can make the world a better, fairer place. Your opinion matters. Let's make a difference.